allows you to get your foot underneath of your center of gravity when you're in a flex position, particularly, especially as you're coming off of the blocks, and you're not decelerating, right? So what really happens during this injury, or these type of injuries, even with patellofemoral syndrome, is that we have this long lever arm. And this is actually a young lady in this picture that I worked with when she was in high school, and you can see she was actually running full speed. There was a loose ball, and she didn't get to the ball before. If you could see, there's another player here that got to the ball before she did, and she was getting ready to cut, and she was going kind of towards her right on a full sprint, and she was getting ready to change direction and go to her left. And another thing that we talked about, a couple weeks ago with the biomechanical stuff, is looking at the position of the lacrosse stick. So the position of the lacrosse stick actually changes the position of the trunk and the upper body and the torque relative to the lower extremity, and particularly to the knee, especially in this coronal and frontal plane issue, right? So if you see there, she's getting ready to strike her heel on the ground. She was, imagining again, she's running full speed. She's getting ready to stop and plant herself on that right leg, and then take a quick, hard right or left turn on that right knee and pivot on that leg. And when that happens, right, the ACL just goes and pops. Right? So you can also get a patellar dislocation in that position as well. Excuse me. And, it also becomes problematic down the line when people are having instability in the patella as well, in terms of patellar subluxations, because they have such a high tendency to go into that position that it also makes them at risk to tear their ACL. We had a young lady who was a volleyball player when I was at the University of Cincinnati that actually had that issue, and she thought that she was subluxing her patella, but in reality, the whole time she actually had torn her ACL at some point, and they had already known that she had a patellar dislocation, so they just kept treating her like she had a patellar dislocation. And eventually, when she got to Cincinnati, she got a full workup, and when we checked her, I think it was actually me that tested her, and we found out that she had an ACL tear, and it was like, and ended up, she also had an osteochondral defect in the cartilage in her knee, and she ended up getting medically disqualified from the being able to play Division I college volleyball, which it's amazing that she was even able to make it that far. So does this picture all make sense to everybody? Yep. Yeah, so this picture is probably kind of the epitomization of what happens during these injuries, right? So in this position, the knee cannot go into valgus safely because the lever arm is too long, the foot is too far away from the base of support that would be underneath of the center of gravity, right? So she can't get into that power position to absorb the impact that in that deceleration phase. So it's automatically, well, not necessarily automatically too, because sometimes I think what happens is that girls get away with this for a long period of time, and they never really have to correct their mechanics until after they end up having the injuries. Does that make sense too? It becomes a habit. No, and that was what I was talking about in this hormones versus pelvis. They've controlled for that. And so there are no biomechanical structural uh, parameters or anything that's related to the neuroendocrine system that's been controlled for at this point that shows that there's a high enough correlation to make that significant. So it's all this neuromuscular control and basically biomechanics. Okay. No, no, no. But when you control for the Q angle, female to female, it's not the major factor. The same with them being on their menstrual cycle. Right. So if you take, the menstrual cycle is easier, right? So if you take, basically the menstrual cycle, and you look at, girls when they're playing sports, and they're in different stages of their menstrual cycle, there's no direct relationship that says during this period of time that they're going to tear their ACL. Same thing with the Q angle. There's no, you know, deviation in the Q angle that when you see that every girl that has that Q angle has a higher, propensity or higher likelihood of tearing the ACL. But you could argue that it's maybe more of a factor in the getting into the valgus positioning, right? But it doesn't necessarily have to do with the ACL tear. So what has to do with the ACL tear is this position that we're looking at right now, where the foot is outside of the center of gravity during the valgus movement. Can you see how far outside that foot is outside of the center of gravity? Right? So this is the positioning that they tend to put their foot in, right? When they're going to plant. Right, right, and that's what I'm trying to say though, Taylor, is that when you control for that female to female, you still don't see that has a factor in why they tear their ACLs, right? So if you take all the females that have a really big Q angle, they don't all do this, and does that make sense? And they don't, right? So that's the factors. Does that make sense? Correct. Correct. Yeah, regardless of the Q angle, they don't all put their foot in this position. Correct.